Hi everyone, and welcome to my coverage of Game 10 from the Anand Carlsen World Chess Championships of 2014. After 3 consecutive draws, Anand now went into his penultimate game with the white pieces. Carlsen was still a point ahead, and it's probably safe to argue that he's been relatively content with draws since his win in round 6, which put him a point ahead in the match. With only 3 games remaining, the pressure is growing at every step and the likelihood of blunders is increasing. So Anand opened with d4, as he has done throughout the match, and after knight f6 came c4, as in all of Anand's games with white. And here Carlsen deviated with g6, going into the Grunfeld after knight c3 and d5. He played this in game 1, of course, but the point is that he had not played it in the 3 games with the black since then, and therefore it was unlikely that Anand expected it. Nevertheless, Anand has clearly had some prep in this line. It was seen in game 1, and so he was still ready to play against this defense. He continued here with knight f3, which was already a deviation from game 1, where he'd played c takes d5, which is the main move in Grunfeld. So bishop g7 and now queen b3, which is the Russian variation. So it's sort of main line, d takes c4, queen takes c4, castles, e4. And now a6, which is the Prince variation, which Kasparov used against Karpov, is one of the most popular choices, the other being a6 instead, which is the Hungarian variation, which Liko likes to use. So a bishop e2, and play followed the main line of the Prince variation, which is first bishop e2, and then c5 and d5, which is the best way for white to play. He shouldn't mess around trying to win pawns with moves like d takes c5, because then comes, for example, bishop e6, queen b5, bishop d7, queen b7, knight takes c5, and black is getting active before white is even castled. One of the drawbacks of the Russian variation with the queen b3 on the 5th move is that black may get play against this queen advancing into the queen side early on in the game. So that's why d5 is what Anand played at this point. And we're still in the theory, of course, so e6, castles, ed5, ed5, which is all mainline for the Prince variation, but here Carlsen played rook e8, which is slightly less common than the main move bishop f5. It's a move that makes sense, of course, because he's taking the open file, and there's ideas such as knight b4 and taking on d5, which is going to remove the defender of the bishop, the defenders, the queen and the knight of the bishop on e2. So bishop g5, Anand stops that plan by pinning the knight, and Carlsen puts the question to the bishop with h6. So Anand continued bishop e3, and he's happy to have provoked this weakness on h6. It will be the source of some tactical ideas later on in the game. Interestingly, one of Anand's seconds, the brilliant Polish player Wojciech, had played this exact line against Ponomariov at the 13th Karpov International in 2012. In actual fact, he lost that game, but it still means that he studied the position very closely, almost certainly with an engine, and therefore understood it very well and the different ideas going on in the positions on the board. And this game followed that one for another few moves. Bishop f5, rook ad1, and now with knight e4 from Carlsen it deviated. The game in question I continued with the queen b6. So yeah, Carlsen continued with knight e4, and black's strategy, Carlsen's idea is clearly to utilize this e4 square. He's got his pieces pointing at that square, so he wants to plant the piece here in the white position and thereby create some pressure on the white position. And Carlsen implements it right away, and he's got plans for counterplay on the queen's side. This long diagonal is open for his bishop, and he can pressurize b2 amongst other things. And as far as Anand is concerned, Similarly to game 3, he now has a passed pawn, and in game 3 that won the game for Anand, so perhaps he was hoping to create a similar kind of setup in some regards in this game. So here he continued with knight takes e4, but also interesting was d6, simply with the threat of d7, which is very strong, or taking on e4 and then playing d7. So white is starting to get a small edge here, and the engines want bishop takes c3, but this is very hard to play from a human point of view, weakening the dark squares around the king very, very badly. More likely really it would be knight takes c3, and it should be noted knight takes d6 isn't working because of queen f4. It's pinning the knights to the queen, and it's attacked twice, so it has to be defended again. A rook e6 is forced, but now bishop takes a6, this removes the defender of c5, b takes a6, now bishop takes c5, and white's winning. So instead of that, knight takes c3 would be more likely. So then b takes c3, and black has a few options here, such as queen a5 and queen f6, but white is slightly better in all lines. So we can backtrack now. So yeah, what Anand did play was knight takes e4, and Carlsen continued with bishop takes e4, which was a surprise. A rook takes e4 was expected by most people watching the game. So now Vishy utilized the fact that he's provoked this weakness on h6 with queen c1, but again, perhaps d6 was stronger. The threat of d7 and then rook d6 is strong. For example, if d7, rook e7, rook d6, rook takes d7, rook takes g6. Oh, sorry, actually, no, that's not possible. The rook is tied to defending the bishop. So for example, if black trades on f3 and then takes on d7 with the rook on d6, white can play rook takes g6 and utilize this pin. So there's all kinds of tactical ideas for white in the position. But after d6, the drawback of this move is that bishop c6 is possible, and black can blockade with bishop d7, and allowing this maneuver, bringing the bishop to d7, may be why Anand was not so keen to push the pawn to d6 so fast. Of course, this is perhaps still his home preparation, and if it is, then he's analyzed it along with his Grandmaster seconds in depth and with engines, so we can trust that he's playing the lines with the strongest ideas. I mean, this looks, very tempting from a club player's point of view, but with a Grandmaster and their knowledge of theory and whatnot, it may actually be weaker to play this way, even though the engines are suggesting it. So what Anand did play was queen c1, and Carlsen continued with queen f6, which is a nice move, offering the h6 pawn in return for the b2 pawn. And I'd be interested to know what Nimzowitsch would think of this continuation, because Carlsen is neglecting to blockade the passed pawn, which surely Nimzowitsch would have recommended in this position. But of course, when you're a player as strong as Carlsen, you know exactly when you can break such dogmatic rules. So we saw an exchange of prisoners. Bishop takes h6, queen takes b2, and now Vishy took the queens off, and indeed it seems like the strongest way to play, especially after knight g5, which gives black some problems to solve. And Carlsen, who had been playing quickly, now spent over half an hour thinking on his move. And with this move, white is effectively winning the bishop pair to go along with his passed pawn, and his position is going to have some good imbalance with these 3 pawns to 1 on the queen side versus the passed d pawn and 3 to 2 on the king side, and plus white having the bishop pair. All in all, it looks quite promising for white. So no wonder that Carlsen spent so long thinking here to try and find out the best way to continue. So obviously this is threatening to take the bishop. Is defended, but the question for black is if he can preserve the bishop, because obviously at Grandmaster level, even at club level, the bishop pair has considerable edge to have it on your opponent, especially in a fairly open position such as this one. So bishop d4 is what Carlsen eventually settled on, and this seems to be best. It's tempting to try and preserve the bishop pair with something like a bishop f5, but then white is getting a significant edge after bishop c4 with the threat of d6. There are ways to counter that threat, but white is getting the initiative here, and he's getting all of the play, and this knight on a6 is looking slightly offside. Okay, so bishop d4. So white wins the bishop pair. Knight takes e4, rook takes e4, and now bishop f3. This bishop was attacked, so it gets the bishop to a better diagonal, defending d5 and putting pressure on b7, and it's doing so with tempo because he's attacking the rook on e4. So rook e7, keeping an eye on the second rank, and now Carlsen is setting up a blockade, so Nimzovich can stop spinning in his grave. So rook d7. And as I said, from here it's also defending the second rank, which is useful as well, and it's now attacking the pawn. So Vishy played bishop f4 to keep an eye on that pawn, and now a knight b4, threatening to take on a2, which Anand defended with rook d2, but this was a small inaccuracy because it's giving up the e-file. Now black is able to play rook e8, and white can't challenge it. So this is slightly wrong from Anand. Better was a3, and after knight c2, again attacking the pawn, a4. Then for example rook e8, rook b1, now bishop e5, bishop takes e5. After this move it's either trade the bishop or lose the pawn. So bishop e5, rook e5, now rook b7 wins the pawn back, but now it's lost again, and now it's won again. So white remains a pawn up, and black is prepared to give this pawn up in order to install the knight at the powerful d4 outpost, so it can never be disturbed from this outpost unless white wants to give up the exchange. Black will have good compensation for the pawn, but white is still better in all lines after, for example, bishop d1, and the fight goes on. This passed pawn is going to be strong, but so is the c pawn, and so is the knight. So something like this it definitely looked like the best bet for white. After Vishy's move, rook d2, comes rook e8, taking the e-file, and with this variation instead, black is equal already. Carlsen has a very calm plan to initiate some exchanges and bring about the draw. White really has to press now if he wants to get at anything, but after rook d2 it doesn't seem possible. So rook e6, this is Carlsen's plan. He's going to play bishop e5. So Anand continued with h4. So bishop e5 again is going to just lose a pawn if the bishop isn't traded. So bishop e5, rook e5, and here in fact it was Anand who forced the draw, feeling that he had nothing better to play for. Bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, d7. This passed pawn makes this whole idea possible, of course. So knight c6 is forced because of the threat of queening. And now a d8 queen, knight takes d8, rook takes d8 check, king g2, rook d2, and the players agree to draw. So it was an unlucky game for Vishy in some respects. He definitely could have pressed harder if he had found some stronger moves. It was another success for his preparation, but Carlsen defended very well. In the press conference it was clear that the pressure is starting to affect both players. Anand was a little testy at times, which is not like him at all, and Carlsen spoke of how the pressure is of course increasing with every game. As far as he's concerned, he's in a fine position as they now have effectively a 2-game match remaining, and being a point ahead he has draw odds. Not only that, but he has white in game 11, which is tomorrow morning, so the pressure will be on Anand, and it'll be interesting to see if Carlsen sticks with 1e4 for his final game with white, and if he does, whether Anand will play the Berlin or some variation of the Roy Lopez, which seems to be a safe bet thus far, or whether he'll mix it up and play the Sicilian again. My guess is that he would play safe and hope to unleash something in game 12 where he has the white pieces. So perhaps it could be argued that the onus is on Magnus to mix it up in the opening tomorrow. And also perhaps there is some pressure on Vishy as well to try something sharper. Okay, he can play for a draw tomorrow, but there's no fighting spirit there. Why not play for a win, and then he can play for a draw in the final game and go into tie-breaks? Or he has white in the final game, so he could play for a win in that game too. When the match gets to this stage, the pressure is so much that blunders become increasingly likely, as we saw in one of the earlier games, game 6 in fact, that Carlsen won. That was Anand's for the taking. He missed that move, knight takes e5, and that was only halfway through the match. So there's every reason to believe that a similar blunder is still possible, even from someone as talented as Carlsen. So we'll see what happens. In any case, it will be a fascinating game, and I'll get a video up on YouTube as soon as I can. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.